A young woman was found murdered in her own home, and the investigation into her case would drag on for decades. Even though the police had a sample of the killer's DNA, they would have to wait 40 long years before technology could finally identify the person responsible. The truth would only surface in 2021, and it was a Coca-Cola can that helped police solve the case. Sylvia Quayle was born on September 23, 1946 in Denver, Colorado. Soon after, she had a younger sister named Jo. The family lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Cherry Hills. Sylvia was ambitious, cheerful, and friendly. She had many friends, and everyone considered her the life of the party. From a young age, she developed a passion for architecture, inspired by the work of her uncle who was in the field. She was also a very creative person who loved sculpting with clay and cooking. After finishing school and university, Sylvia got a job as a secretary at a local architectural firm. Thanks to her culinary skills, she also started a small side business, baking custom wedding cakes. Sylvia maintained a very close and trusting relationship with her family. She rented a home just 50 yards away from her parents and tried to see them every day. Very often, she would stop by their place for breakfast before heading to work. On the evening of August 3, 1981, Sylvia, who was 35 years old at the time, spoke with her younger sister on the phone. They arranged to meet the next morning, and at around 11 p.m., Sylvia went to bed. The following day, at about 8 a.m., her father stopped by to pick her up so they could go get coffee together. However, no one answered when he knocked on the door, so he assumed his daughter was still asleep. He then entered the house, only to be met with a heart-wrenching sight. Sylvia was lying on the living room floor. She was completely naked with her hands folded above her head. There was blood all over the room, and her body had been mutilated. The man struggled to compose himself and called the police. Before they arrived, he covered Sylvia with a towel. The police who arrived at the crime scene examined the house and made several important discoveries. First, the telephone cord in the living room had been cut. The wire outside was also damaged. The killer had thrown a garden hose over it and snapped it with a sharp downward pull. This all suggested that the unknown assailant had made sure the victim couldn't call for help. Second, the killer had tried to enter Sylvia's house through several windows. On the screen of the window in her bedroom, detectives found a small hole. This indicated that the perpetrator initially tried to get in that way, but failed for some reason. He then turned his attention to the bathroom window. Its screen had been removed and thrown into the bushes more than 50 feet from the house. There were pry marks on the wooden window frame. Detectives also determined that the window itself hadn't been locked initially. This was easily explained by the weather. There had been an unbearable heat wave for days, and people had to leave their windows open to get some relief. In total, about 140 different pieces of evidence were found at the crime scene. But in those years, forensics didn't yet have the right tools for a detailed analysis. After speaking with Sylvia's relatives, the police established an approximate timeline for the murder. It happened sometime between her 11 p.m. phone call with her sister and the moment her father arrived at 8 a.m. Upon examining Sylvia's body, medical experts made several key findings. The woman had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon and had also been stabbed with a sharp object. Forensic analysts determined that the attacker had used a knife from Sylvia's own kitchen. Furthermore, it was highly probable that she had been sexually assaulted. Experts also concluded that she had tried to fight back before her death, which was indicated by several broken fingernails. Unfortunately, none of these clues brought the police any closer to catching the culprit. In those days, experts simply didn't have the necessary tools to get any leads from the available evidence. The police also couldn't find a single witness who might have seen the killer that night. Because of this, the case saw absolutely no progress for 2 years. In 1983, forensic experts decided to re-examine the evidence from the crime scene using a new laser technology developed by Canadian scientists. This technology existed at the time of Sylvia's murder, but back then, the necessary equipment was only available in a Canadian lab, and using it was incredibly expensive. By '83, however, portable and cheaper lasers started to appear, allowing experts to take another look at the evidence, and it paid off. On the carpet in Sylvia's living room, they found traces of foreign biological material that most likely belonged to the perpetrator. However, science was still a long way from being able to identify the killer from this data. That same year, the notorious serial killer and robber Otis Toole confessed to murdering Sylvia. At first, the police and the victim's family hoped the case would finally be closed, but his statement was quickly cast into doubt. He gave conflicting accounts and couldn't recall any significant details about the crime. In total, Toole confessed to 125 murders, of which only 6 were ever proven, so his words weren't taken seriously. From then on, the case went cold for 12 years, until it was reopened in 1995. By that time, forensic science had taken a huge leap forward. Investigators hoped to get more data from the biological sample on the carpet. It was sent to an FBI lab, but even they couldn't extract the DNA profile quickly. It took a full 5 years before there was a long-awaited breakthrough. In the year 2000, the police finally had the killer's DNA profile. It was entered into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This meant the perpetrator had no prior convictions for serious crimes, or if he did, it was before the mandatory collection of DNA from defendants. At this point, the case hit a dead end once again. All the police could do was hope that Sylvia's killer would get caught for another crime and have his DNA entered into the system. There were no other ways to identify him back then, but progress didn't stand still. In 2019, almost 20 years after the DNA sample was extracted, a non-profit organization called Crime Stoppers of Metro Denver teamed up with a genealogy company led by a former district attorney. Together, they worked on cold cases where police had the killer's DNA but couldn't identify them. The organization searched through genetic databases, looking for relatives of the DNA owner. The company's research helped solve numerous cases that had been considered hopeless for decades. In January 2020, detectives from the Cherry Hills Cold Case Unit reached out to the organization for help, providing them with the DNA sample of Sylvia's killer. They began their search using 2 public DNA databases, which were mainly used by people looking for relatives and building their family trees. People from all over the world could upload their DNA samples to find lost or even unknown family members. In the case of Sylvia's killer, the specialists had to do the same thing, but they ran into a problem. The databases contained over 3,000 relatives of this person. The experts had a colossal amount of work ahead of them to narrow it down to the right name. They started digging for any information on these people, gradually eliminating distant relatives and those who couldn't have committed the murder due to their age at the time. After 4 long months of work, they were finally left with just one name: David Dwayne Anderson. Investigators found that at the time of Sylvia's murder, he was 22 years old and lived nearby in Englewood. Detectives determined that he had since moved to a small town called Cozad, Nebraska, but they couldn't arrest him for murder just yet. For that, they needed stronger evidence, like a direct match of his DNA to the sample found at Sylvia's crime scene. On January 18, 2021, detectives went to his house and began surveillance. They waited until David came outside to throw away his trash. One of the officers then retrieved 2 trash bags from the container and sent their contents to the lab. Inside, the bags were 15 items that could help detectives get a sample of David's DNA. Among them was a Coca-Cola can, as well as bottles of water, spiced rum, and beer. Almost 2 weeks later, experts were finally able to extract a DNA sample from the Coca-Cola can. It was immediately compared to the sample found at Sylvia's murder scene, and they got a perfect match. 40 years later, the police finally had the killer's name. He was arrested on February 10th and charged with murder. The man was now 62 years old. The arrest was announced at a major press conference, during which investigators expressed their condolences to Sylvia's family. The Cherry Hills Chief of Police, Michelle Tovry, also spoke. She told the attendees what kind of person Sylvia was and prepared slides with her photos to accompany the story. Sadly, Sylvia's parents didn't live to see the day her killer's name was finally known. Her father passed away in 1999, and her mother 10 years later. However, investigators notified her younger sister, and she participated in the court proceedings against David. Looking into his background, detectives discovered that Anderson had been involved in at least 8 burglaries between 1981 and 1986. He had been caught by the police but never received any serious punishment. Based on this, the investigation proposed 2 theories. Either Sylvia's murder was premeditated and planned in advance, or David had intended to rob her house but was confronted by her, and a struggle ensued. He himself refused to plead guilty, so the case was sent to trial. If Anderson is convicted of murder, he faces a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years. That was the state law in 1981, at the time of Sylvia's murder. Today, criminals imprisoned for murder are not eligible for parole. Anderson was supposed to be jailed in Dawson County, Nebraska, but he refused extradition and was instead incarcerated in Colorado. The trial was initially scheduled to conclude on March 8, 2022, but as often happens, the process was delayed. The next hearing is scheduled for June 27th, but at this point, there is virtually no doubt that the man will be found guilty. We'll keep you updated on the case. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel, where we also publish true life stories and other incredible events. Let us know what you think about this case in the comments. And don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.